Good evening and welcome to the Week in Review. I'm Paris Schutz. We'll be joined by our Week in Review guests in just a moment, but first, some of today's top stories. Chicago's police superintendent announces stepped-up patrols in the Loop as holiday shopping season is in full swing. And this comes, of course, on the heels of multiple violent incidents in the last week, including this mob attack on a CTA bus driver. As we're looking at some Twitter video of that right here. David Brown announced 20 arrests for disorderly conduct and battery in connection with that attack last weekend. And we'll have more on the beefed-up security plans in just a bit. Governor Pritzker signs legislation he says will help curtail violent crime in Illinois. It's part of a package of bills called the Reimagine Public Safety Act, and it directs more resources to community-based organizations to help fight youth violence. It also creates a new, quote, Office of Firearm Violence Prevention, which purports to direct more resources to communities with the highest rates of violence. Pritzker says the legislation responds to residents' concerns about public safety.
What they want is to make sure that we're investing in the patrols of our highways like we are doing with our state police. What they want is to make sure that we're addressing the underlying causes of violence in our communities, and that is what we are doing.
A Chicago congresswoman is the subject of an expanding House ethics investigation. The House Committee on Ethics announced its expanding investigation into Representative Marie Newman, who represents the city's southwest side and southwest suburbs. The investigation stems from allegations that Newman promised a job to someone to dissuade them from running against her in the 2020 Democratic primary. Newman defeated longtime incumbent Dan Lipinski in 2020 and has announced she is running against current incumbent Sean Casten in the newly drawn 6th Congressional District. And now to our Week in Review panel, and joining us are Monica Eng of Axios Chicago, Omar Jimenez of CNN, Mariah Woelfel of WBEZ, and Rachel Hinton of the Chicago Sun-Times. Let's get right to the big news of the week. We start with the verdict heard round the world. Jussie Smollett found guilty of lying to police and filing a false police report. Here's what lawyers on both sides had to say last night.
Defendants have a right to argue that their case has not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but defendants do not have the right to go in front of a jury and lie under oath.
We feel 100% confident that this case will be won on appeal. Unfortunately, that's not the route we wanted, but sometimes that's the route that you have to take to win.
Omar Jimenez, first, welcome to the Week in Review. Take us inside the courtroom at 26 and Cal when this verdict was read.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously a big moment. I mean, it was one that had been 3 years or nearly 3 years in the making at that point. And when everybody stood and rose for the jury and the foreperson began to read out the verdict one by one, guilty after guilty, until that final 6 count where he wasn't guilty, Jussie Smollett stood there rigid as a statue, did not move one bit. He stood up, watched it, eyes straight ahead, afterward sat down, fingers interlaced on the table in front of him as the judge congratulated the jury and thanked them for their efforts over the course of these past few weeks, which took the jurors into the late evening hours at points. But I cannot emphasize enough, he did not break his gaze, did not move at all for a good portion of probably 10 minutes. And the only words he ever said in the courtroom after it was over was the judge told him that there will be a sentencing hearing potentially in the future and that he would need to be there and he'd be sentenced if he was there or not, but the penalties would likely be worse if he wasn't there. He asked him if he understood, and Jussie Smollett said, "I understand." Those were the only words we heard him say, and he was ushered out, of course, pretty quickly.
And speaking of the sentencing, Omar, you heard the special prosecutor Dan Webb say there that this guilty verdict indicates that Smollett lied under oath on the stand. Do you think that factors into sentencing?
That's something we asked him, actually, in those moments, in the sense that you're saying he lied under oath, perjury, of course, and he said, well, that's something we're going to get into in sentencing. And he said it's something he's going to bring up in arguing for a stiffer sentence because he said it wasn't fair to not only the judicial system, but also the jurors that were sitting in the courtroom there as well.
And Monica Eng, as we look at this case, I mean, the crux of the defense was to basically smear the Osendero brothers, the alleged co-conspirators here. Do they have some sort of potential defamation case, given all the things that were said about them?
I guess that remains to be seen. You know, Axios, we we decided we weren't going to really cover this a lot because so many people were already covering it and it was so saturated. And, you know, a lot of people have brought up the point that there's so many things going on in Chicago that is this what, you know, news organizations, no offense to Omar, should be, you know, spending all of their limited resources on, and what Chicago should be. So, you know, it remains to be seen. Obviously, there's going to be an appeal, and we'll see what more charges there are.
Certainly, it's a similar discussion we had in our newsroom, how much to cover this case. Rachel Hinton, did it deserve all the international attention it got, or was it an unfortunate distraction from some of the very real pressing problems of violence in Chicago?
I hate to give the, you know, on the one hand, but on the other. But on the one hand, yes, I mean, this captivated the city in 2019. It was still unresolved. It's been 3 years. There was a lot of political fallout or political ramifications, especially for Kim Foxx, who dropped charges initially back in, I believe, March of 2019. So it makes sense to cover it from that perspective. Also, when Smollett, you know, alleged that this attack happened, I believe many people in the city felt that it dragged the city's name through the mud. But on the other hand, crime is up. Homicides are up. We, I believe, logged our 1,000th homicide either this week or last week recently. So I believe that the questions around, you know, did this deserve as much coverage as it got? Those are very valid questions. But I think we also need to look ahead. Sure, we covered this now, but what does it mean, especially in terms of politics and what it means for the city? What does this mean for Kim Foxx? I don't think very much. She was reelected last year. She believes that, you know, because of that reelection, this means that the county voters did not think that Smollett was an important issue. But I think going forward, if, you know, in 2024, she gets a candidate, an opponent who can weaponize this in the right way, she might be in trouble. She might be forced to once again answer questions about that.
Well, Mariah Wolf, speaking of that, let's remind everybody why there was this second trial. Judge Mike Tooman assigned a special prosecutor, Dan Webb, to look into this after State's Attorney Kim Foxx dropped the initial case with a very small penalty, perfunctory community service, no admission of guilt. So many questions swirling around why that happened. Do you think this verdict puts her under the microscope again?
Well, I would echo Rachel's answer to say that I think we have seen the political ramifications already, and don't quote me that will be all that we see, but I do think that we've seen a widening gap, wedge between the relationship of State's Attorney Kim Foxx and the Chicago police, and that's become very public in the past, you know, even just 6 months here, if you look at the way that they've, Police Superintendent David Brown and Kim Foxx have been going back and forth in the media, including with Mayor Lori Lightfoot. But I do think it is of note that we haven't seen the mayor or Superintendent Brown really speak publicly about this case or use it as a weapon against Kim Foxx so far. And so that's obviously something to look out for. And of course, as Rachel said, a candidate may come along who's able to do that in 2024.
And part of the reason these are serious felony charges, Omar Jimenez, is the fact that the Chicago police use so many resources when they've believed initially it was a hate crime. They believed what Smollett said. There were 26 detectives on it, and the FOP says it totaled 3,200 hours working on this case. I mean, what does that say about how serious a problem Smollett is facing now?
Well, and that was a theme that came up multiple times. After the trial was over and Special Prosecutor Dan Webb made his comments, he reserved the whole section just for the Chicago Police Department, saying that this was the justice that they deserved for putting in the efforts of treating this as a real crime when the jurors in this case decided, no, that's not really what happened. So that is likely something he's going to argue when it comes time in regards to figuring out a sentence for Jussie Smollett. And just to echo some of what everyone was saying, you know, on the significance of this within, of course, so many significant things happening in Chicago. I think this was an unusual case in that it was drip, 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 dragged out for so long. I think in a lot of cases, you know, something happens, you have your trial and it's over within a year and a half. I don't think you have many cases where something this bombastic allegedly happens, you have this much attention, then you have charges dropped, you have charges reinstated, then you have another trial that Judge James Lynn said was only going to last 4 to 5 days. We're now stretching into a 7th and 8th day. People growing more anxious. Why is it taking so long? You're hearing of lawyers crying in the courtroom. And all of a sudden it does become this big spectacle that does distract away from issues, important ones that may, in a way that a typical trial might not.
And speaking of some of those issues of violence all over the city, but especially now downtown, that brutal CTA bus driver being beaten up footage, especially as shopping season is in full swing. Mariah Woelfel, the CPD announced stepped up security. Is that going to calm some of the folks' nerves downtown, some of the older people that are representing the businesses and residents there that are really fed up?
Well, I guess we'll have to see what happens this weekend. CPD is going to beef up patrols, as you said. There's going to be a private security firm apparently monitoring the CTA. And so we'll have to see how it plays out this weekend.
And Monica Yang, one of the things the mayor's talking about is a real small excise tax on some properties in the Magnificent Mile for beefed up security. Is that something you think would fly?
Well, you know, I did a story last summer about some of the incidents that were happening downtown, and some of the different associations on the Mag Mile that wanted the city to do more, that wanted to get together and do more. I wonder if they will take umbrage at getting an excise tax just on them when they're already paying their property taxes and they're already paying.
And in addition, the mayor is saying, hey, they should spend their own money and hire private security.
Yeah, like Bucktown. Yeah, I mean, and I wonder, is that going to be the future? That the communities that can afford it will beef up the security with private security when you have other parts of the city saying, hey, we're over-policed. I mean, it's just so many mixed messages. Give us more security, give us less security. If I were the mayor, I'm not sure I'd know what to do.
And Rachel Hinton, even a bit of a mixed message from State's Attorney Kim Foxx, we just talked about. Now she's talking about perhaps rethinking the prosecution of retail theft, just given all this smash and grab theft that's going on. What's she talking about doing?
I think that when she first came into office, she changed the way the retail thefts were initially prosecuted, and now she's talking about going back to slightly closer to what it was beforehand, I believe. I think that, it makes sense given that crimes are up and people don't feel safe walking around downtown, whether or not that leads to any sort of change, whether or not that leads to more prosecutions, obviously remains to be seen. We need to see some more details to come out and things put in place before we can really take a look at whether or not this helps crime.
Omar Jimenez, you can kind of give us an interesting national perspective since you work for a national news outlet. How do your bosses at CNN look at the issue of crime in Chicago and want you to cover the issue, and do they understand it in the way that perhaps local citizens see it?
Well, and part of that is an interesting dynamic that you point out. Part of me being here is I am sort of the conduit where people come in from the outside and say, hey, what is happening? And I say, okay, well, here are the dynamics that are at play. But I will say from a national perspective, whenever I'm told by my people, let's zoom out a little bit, is that, over the past year and a half, it has been an issue that is not just unique to Chicago. We've seen increases in violent crime in cities all across the country. My hometown of Atlanta is one of the major examples where there's a mall area that used to be seen as sort of a luxury district, almost if you were going to make the analogy to downtown or so, and has seen specific increases in violent crime to where now people don't feel safe going to that part of town. So I think that's something that is always sort of reminded on my end. Obviously, there is this label, for better or for worse, of Chicago being, susceptible to high levels of violence. And so there's a bigger magnifying glass on the city when you're seeing increases in violence across the country. People look to Chicago almost as a barometer to see, well, if it's bad across the country, how bad is it in Chicago? And unfortunately, the numbers have been there to back it up, at least compared to pre-pandemic levels.
Approaching possibly 800 homicides, although, as you mentioned, Omar, I mean, this is a crime wave that's happening across the city. I believe Philadelphia recorded a record number of homicides, and as bad as Chicago is doing this year, it's likely not going to reach the record that it set in the early 90s. Speaking of violence, Rachel Hinton, State Representative Jonathan Carroll says he got some violent threats for a COVID piece of legislation that he put forward to ask folks that are unvaccinated to pay for their own medical coverage if they go to the hospital for COVID. What happened there?
Yeah, he received death threats. He says racial slurs. Someone emailed his synagogue threatening or basically warning the synagogue that this legislation was going to put them at risk. And so he withdrew the legislation. He tabled it. He filed a motion, I believe, yesterday to do that. When I spoke to him, he said that this is, ridiculous. It's another sign that we can't have conversations around this virus, around vaccinations. And if you do try to do that, it becomes very divisive. And not just divisive, but obviously people make threats. People take it very personally and to such a level that they're willing to make threats against, a state rep and his family. Going forward, I mean, it remains to be seen what's going to happen with this COVID legislation. Obviously, this thing is done, but I think that there is potentially support for something addressing COVID and hopefully trying to push the unvaccinated to get vaccines. I don't think that changing the insurance policy, like what State Rep Jonathan Carroll was trying to do, I don't think obviously that's going to happen or that that's supported. But I think that we haven't seen, the end of legislators maybe trying to find a way to convince the unvaccinated to get shots.
And on the local level in Chicago, Monica Eng, Dr. Allison Arwady at CDPH is talking about the possibility of New York City-style vax mandates, so mandatory vaccination proof to do certain indoor activities. Obviously in New York, to go to bars, clubs, you do have to have a vaccine status and proof of it. Do you think they're going to go that route in Chicago?
Well, I mean, she was asked about it, and she said that she would prefer that over, big total lockdowns. So she wasn't, super conclusive about it. But, I've been talking to the health department, and I've been talking to Business Affairs and Consumer Protection, specifically about the much loved and much hated T-Box this weekend, where 10,000 kids, or people over 21 ostensibly, will descend on Wrigleyville, 30 bars in Wrigleyville, 10,000 people. And BACP tells me, well, they have to follow the mask mandate. What's the mask mandate? That when they walk in, they need to be wearing a mask. But if you've got a drink, no mask, because suddenly you're protected from COVID because you're drinking and smashed in with 10,000 other people.
What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? And we're in the biggest surge we've seen in 11 months, and we really think that it's a great idea to have 10,000 kids jammed into 30 bars without masks, largely.
It doesn't seem like it will deter that annual event. Mariah Woelfel, there's a big heated battle going on in City Council over allowing sports books, sports gambling in and around stadiums. First of all, why is this so heated when we're talking about the city proposing a 2% tax, which would net $500,000 in tax revenue, which is the equivalent of a couple city workers?
Right. Well, of course, because we have this long-awaited casino that finally looks like it's going to come to fruition in Chicago. And so I think that there's a big push from at least one casino operator who's submitted a bid for the casino, Neil Bloom, Chicago billionaire, who's very much opposed to allowing sports betting in the city of Chicago. The mayor has flipped her position on it. I think initially she was opposed in 2019, I think, when it was initially proposed, saying as well that she thought that profits from sports betting could cannibalize profits from Chicago casino, which will rake in much, much more, $200 million annually. And I think that people who are in support of the casino and believe that sports betting could cannibalize that don't want to be focusing on sports betting right now. On the other hand, there are aldermen who say, we've been waiting on a casino for decades. Why don't we move ahead with this sure revenue, as small as it may be, $400,000, $500,000, but why don't we start getting it on the books? It would allow sports betting at 5 different Chicago casinos. And then there are aldermen who say that 2% is not nearly enough, that this bill also does not do anything to help, minority businesses, Black-owned businesses, Latino businesses, women-owned businesses. And so I think a lot of aldermen are saying, let's hit the brakes, slow down,
There are various studies that are being cited, although I don't really know what groups are looking at when they come out with their studies on whether, allowing sportsbook at a casino would cannibalize the potential profits at the new Chicago casino should it be built. But Mariah, you mentioned that the mayor was lock, stock, and barrel opposed to sports books in stadiums, making that argument. She did a 180. Do we have any idea why?
Well, I think her department heads have said that it is because of the independent study that the city commissioned that showed that 96% of gaming happens online, and it would not have material effects on a Chicago casino. So that's the reasoning that the mayor's office gives.
And you mentioned Neil Bloom. Neil Bloom has 2 bids out there, 2 of the 5 bids for Chicago casino through his Rush Street Gaming. He's very concerned about this, obviously. He testified against it, although another one of the bidders, Bally's, said, nah, we're not so concerned. So why is he concerned and why are they not?
Well, I think proponents of sports betting have pointed out that Bloom is the only, bidder who already has a sports book in the suburbs. And so kind of implying that he's trying to protect the profits that he's making in Des Plaines at Rivers Casino and doesn't want to see those profits head to Chicago at 5 different stadiums.
Omar Jimenez, I don't know if you're a gambling man or not, but if the potential to do some sports gambling at Wrigley Field was presented to you, would it dissuade you from going to a Chicago casino?
I mean, personally, just thinking among the groups with my friends, I feel like you would go for the most convenient option. I don't think the everyday person is thinking about the overall economics of the city long term. And so I think that would be a real issue, whatever concerns there are about having it, in Wrigleyville and cannibalizing profits from the casino. I think that's a real concern, because if you're already over there and you're a young person who might already be betting online, period, to begin with, why are you going out to a casino if you can do it right there? So I think those concerns are real. And again, if I just had to take a poll of my friend group, at least the majority of them, they would probably, unscientific poll, of course, they would probably go for the Wrigleyville option.
And in a political sense, Monica Eng, and I have no proof of anything, but if you're a mayor of Chicago, you want to make the sports team owners happy. I mean, they are big-time political contributors. Neil Bloom is also a big-time political contributor. You really don't want to make him unhappy. Maybe it portends that he wins the bid down the line. Are there any politics at play here?
Well, I mean, the mayor probably made a lot of Bears fans unhappy with her seemingly blithe feelings.
I think the Bears organization has also made some Bears fans, all Bears fans unhappy. Right. Let's just stipulate that. But
nobody's happy with the Bears or the mayor. Yeah, I mean, I could see politics working into this too. I mean, it certainly already has, as we're all looking at it. I'm not a better myself, but younger people like Omar and his friends, and my son loves betting on sports. I mean, I can see this as being a very attractive thing for them and something they could get into right away. And, as the aldermen say, who support it, get some money coming in right away before this long-awaited casino that may never happen finally happens.
Well, and as we mentioned, it's already happening online in terms of the sports book, and most young people are going online to do that, although we had some representatives from the gaming industry say it's a different demographic that would go into the casino to do sports betting, and it's an entirely different demographic that goes into casinos now to pull the slot machines. Mariah Woelfel, would you bet that there's going to be a vote on this again in City Council, and does it have the votes to pass, allowing this and getting that 2% tax?
Well, I think the mayor's probably working hard to sway some of her allies who it was clear that they were not ready either to vote yes or to vote on this on, when was it? A couple days ago. We'll just say that. But it is coming back up. They recessed abruptly once they realized they may not have the votes. It's coming back up on Monday and could potentially go to the City Council on Wednesday. I've learned in my short time so far on this beat to not make bets on whether something will come up for a vote in committee, but the potential, we'll see what happens this week.
You're not the kind of person that's going to wind up in the sports book, either at a stadium or at the potential new Chicago casino. Rachel Hinton, let's talk about some of the remap efforts that are going on. There's some lawsuits right now to some of these new Illinois legislative maps. They're moving forward. Where do they stand right now?
Currently is in the hands of a 3-judge panel in federal court. They heard oral arguments this week from the NAACP, from lawyers representing the Latino Policy Forum, as well as others representing Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch and Senate President Don Harmon. The plaintiffs were trying to prove to the judges that these maps dilute political power for Latinos and Black state residents. The legislative side of things says they couldn't be further from the truth. We really tried to keep that in mind. Why would, a Black state rep vote for this bill or vote for these maps if that is true? Now it's in their hands. It's not clear yet when we'll have a ruling. It could come this week or next week, rather. They heard arguments earlier this week, I believe Tuesday. Slow moving there, little movement there since that case.
All right, we'll watch for that, and we'll watch for that potential sports wager vote next week. But we are out of time now, so our thanks to Monica Eng, Omar Jimenez, Mariah Wolfel, and Rachel Hinton. And that is our show for this Friday night. Don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight and the Week in Review streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. And be sure to join us tomorrow night at 6 for Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, and then immediately after that, Chicago Tonight Black Voices at 6:30. And then we're back at 7 o'clock all next week. And for the Week in Review, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great weekend.
Closed captioning is made possible